Welcome to the OhSoSpurs podcast. Today, alongside a professor and a professional coach, we are going to talk through why you might be, are being largely misled by data at the moment. And it's getting more and more mainstream on all the major channels. There's graphs and visualizations. Armchair pundits are putting it on every platform in front of you. But now it's so easy to paint any picture you want because there's so much data. And we're going to give examples of what to look for and why you should take it much less seriously. Yes, we did say that. Take the data less seriously. Maybe there's something in the old, analogy that some managers have that the game's simpler than you think it is, and the eye test is the most important one. But to join me today, we have Aaron, aka Prof Spur. How are you, mate?
Yeah, I'm well. Glad to be back chatting with you. How are you doing?
Doing very well, thanks. Yes, doing good. Christmas decks are all over the house, and I've been looking forward to this one. And we have, as many will be familiar with, of course, from a coach's view, we have JJ.
Good, thanks. Delighted to be on with Aaron as well.
Yes,
Absolutely.
It's a great lineup, guys. I'll start with Aaron, actually, because Aaron, you wrote and did a load of research into why pass maps, and I know people are expecting us to start with XG. We'll get there. We'll get there and why those wagon wheels of players are misleading. We'll get there with all that kind of stuff. But pass maps and heat maps, we see them a lot now. What did you find in your research for this? Why are they so misleading?
Yeah, so I assume people listening and watching have seen these, but in case you haven't, I'm talking about a type of data visualization in football, which is usually a rectangle meant to represent the pitch with some dots on it meant to represent the players, and they're usually labeled with their shirt numbers. And then a bunch of lines connecting the dots, which are meant to represent the number of passes between those different combinations of players and roughly where on the pitch that passing took place. So a pass map is basically a type of network graph. It represents the relationships between the nodes in a network, which are the players in football terms here, via the edges in the network, which are the lines or the passing relationships. And so what I did was, just to push on this a little bit, I extracted the underlying passing data from some pass maps. This is just the raw numbers, like how many times did Mickey Van de Ven receive a pass from Vicario against Arsenal, for example. So basic raw data. I took that same data and I graphed it in a couple of different ways, just making different assumptions and choices about how I wanted to represent it. So I ignored the spatial component of the pitch and I just made a kind of floating network, for example, in one of them. And the point of doing this was basically to show that you can take the exact same underlying data and you can choose to graph it in different ways that will give you very different images and thus very different impressions about what's actually happening on the pitch and what that data is meant to represent. And so the takeaway is a lot of people look at, I think, data visualizations in football and beyond and think of them as a kind of objective form of evidence, but they're just not. They have background choices and assumptions behind them that can really change the way you think about things and how the image represents what's happening. And I didn't think of this when I was writing the piece, but even afterward, I realized that pass maps almost always represent dyadic relationships or passes between groups of two players. Rarely do they represent triads or groups of three players, combinations. And you can think, well, maybe that's just because passing between two players is somehow more important, but probably not. Probably the reason that's the case is because it's just harder to do a pass map with combos of three players rather than two. You have less data to work with because it's harder to make two passes consecutively than one. So there are all these factors that go into people's choices. And I think that's just important to bear in mind when we look at things like pass maps.
That is such a good point about, pass maps just looking at the actions between two individuals, because that doesn't show any form of team cohesion, really.
Sure.
You're just completing one move. You're not completing a sequence. Again, you can just highlight that X player, can pass it forward lots between one other player. That's not actually a representation of them maybe building up in the right way or setting up the right attacking play that a more difficult pass would have warranted. So, yeah. What are your views on this? Do you kind of, when you're working with players, how much do you focus on the data side versus the eye test with these kind of things?
I mean, it really depends what level you're working with, who you're working with, what resources you've got, right? But if we're talking about the elite level, the top level, then everything is available to you, and therefore you would be foolish not to use everything at your disposal. But to touch on the pass maps stuff, and for anyone that hasn't read Aaron's article, go and read it because it's fantastic. And I'm afraid I can't bring military strategy to my analysis. I'm going to stick to the football. But the exact point about a pass map is just an indicative tool for players and for coaching staff to look at, and for fans who want to look into this kind of thing, to look at large themes. So directionally, where are the passes going? Are they predominantly going narrow into the center? Are they going down one side of the pitch? All of this kind of thing. You can draw some conclusions, and those conclusions might be right. But some of the key stuff is what Aaron's saying there at the end. If you're just looking at a pass going from player A to player B, and then player B becomes player A to another player B, and then so on and so forth, what you're not getting is you have got 22 players, and this is it, football is chaos, all doing something at that moment. So every individual pass has 22 players doing something, including standing completely still and doing nothing. But there are 22 people, including a referee as well, all doing something at that moment in time, and a pass map will not bring up that data. If you imagine the complexity that would be required just to have, if you put it in the final third, to give an example, of a key pass or a through ball or an incisive pass in an attacking part of the pitch. Just imagine now how many layers you would need to have the runs off the ball, a third man run. Does the goalkeeper come? Does he stay? What movement does he make while that ball is moving? And everybody else on the pitch and what they're doing. Was one of the defenders slow to recognize it, slow to make the move, didn't move across? All of these things are not represented on that data. So if we're looking at a pass map, you can draw out some thick, bigger gross themes, but you can't really get into it. And there's only one way to do that, which is to layer a ton of context on top of it. And that's, I think, where we're going to go next.
Go on, Aaron.
Well, I just wanted to point out, to underscore, you can see just from this already in this conversation, the way that JJ looks at a pass map as a coach is going to be, it's going to be with insight and with understanding that's very different from, and I would say probably in excess of, i.e. more informed than the way that most fans and analysts, amateur analysts like myself would see it. So when we're having arguments about data visualizations like pass maps as fans and what that shows, we're seeing one thing in the data, in the visualization, but a coach is using it perhaps for a completely different purpose than we're even talking, than we're even having a conversation about. And that insight unto itself, I think, is really valuable.
Yeah. And like JJ was saying, the thing is, once you start to layer too much data on top of each other as well, it becomes so hard to decipher and find insights into. It starts to look like when I give my child a blank piece of paper and a big box of crayons and all different colors. It's like, well, I know there's a house supposedly drawn in there and I'm holding his hand somewhere in there, but to me it's just squiggles all over the place of different colors. Like, it's also the bias, right? There's so much data that you can paint it, that we start with this, in to show something specific without its full context to justify your argument or your point. So you could just say, right, like, I've made my mind up. This is the problem with Thomas Frank's system. And you can go and find data points to back that up. Equally, I could say, I'm adamant his system's perfect and it's failing because of a different reason. I'll be able to go find data to back that up, as long as I only show specific bits of data without the full context around it. And I think we see this all the time. People almost work their way back from their opinions. So they start with their opinion, then they go get the data to back it up. And that it kind of makes analysis quite easy and less truthful a lot of the time. And then, you just get a great GUI visualization, spread it across a simple tactics board, and you go, told you, that's all you need to do. But it's not just pass maps, folks. It's the, I can't stand, it's these wagon wheels of this player is better than this one. And you take 8 broad criterias, the shit is at number 10, you'll go forward passes, pass accuracy, expected goals created, and then you put them into percentiles. And you can pretty much, $4.99 a month, go on something like FBref, and anyone in the world can now compare any 2 players in any professional league. And it's made a lot of people experts to, well, if I just filter by players in top percentiles, found another bargain for Spurs. But I guess I'm open to either. Like, surely there's variances in there, like the different leagues, the style of football they're playing in, how long they've been playing in that role. How are those 8 metrics that they're measured themselves? How do you come to those conclusions? Do people even know that? And are all those stats even relevant for the role that player you're signing is going to be playing in? I think, JJ, you've told me before, like some of these stats about like certain metrics here are, not very useful as for comparing potential signings as some people think they are.
Yeah, exactly that. And don't get me wrong, there is value, right? There is value to this stuff. We're not saying that statistics don't have any role to play and they shouldn't be there and nobody's using them. They can be very valuable, and obviously they're there as a proxy a lot of time. As big as the scouting networks are for all the top clubs, they cannot physically have a very experienced scout, somebody that knows what they're looking at and knows what they're looking for on behalf of the football club, sat at every game to be able to take in all of the context. And so you need something like this. You need these statistics, you need these sites, you need the recorded clips and all that kind of stuff to add to what scouting departments and coaches are looking for. But what I would say is, if you look at these wagon wheels, they can easily be inflated or deflated by a number of factors, right? So volume statistics, for example, so the number of times that a player does something. If you imagine you take the same individual and you put them in 2 very different systems, the volume, the number of times that they do a specific thing is going to change drastically. If you take the same individual and you move them, same system, right? Let's imagine a structure like the Leipzig structure, where the Red Bull structure, where you're going to have several teams playing fairly similar systems, but you can put them in the different Red Bull team in a different league against different opposition. Again, the volume statistics are going to look very different. If you take number 10s playing for top clubs and number 10s playing for lower clubs, if you take goalkeepers playing for relegation candidate sides and their volume stats, what that's going to look like loads and loads of saves, that's going to look brilliant. But they're playing for a very different club to a goalkeeper that has absolutely nothing to do for 89 minutes, but then has 2 key moments that they have to deal with. And can they deal with those moments? So again, all of those kind of things mean that it can be very, very difficult to compare. And therefore, it's only one little bit of the story. And it really does need to be done so carefully when you're comparing, because you have to add all of those other things on top when you're doing the wagon wheel stuff. It's not just passes completed. It's not just through balls. It's not headers won. It's not tackles. It's everything. And then the league, and then the team, and then the system, and then the coach, and then the confidence, and then did my wife leave me? And then everything on top of that. It's complicated, that there really is no substitute, I'm afraid, for also adding the eye test to it.
And like you touched on there, we've mentioned this loads before. Collectively, these are humans, not robots that just have very consistent equal output every time you put them on a pitch. Like some do, the best players do actually, so I'm lying a bit there. But like you said, a child could come along, a change in your personal life, an injury that changes things, and your confidence can change. The league you're moving in could be very different. There's just so many. You get a new boot sponsor that's not really working out for you. There's so many things that can cause a change in the wind, and offset things as well, that these things just don't factor for at all. Age, is that player on the rise? Are they on the decline? Are certain physical attributes changing? They're just such snapshots in time. It's a bit like taking, a balance sheet and then of 1 year and just saying that company is therefore amazing without any context as to what the last 10 years have all been about around it as well. XG and expected threat. These are the in vogue ones at the moment, right, Aaron? These are the trendy ones. You don't look at anymore. Sky don't bring up the Premier League table. It's all about the expected table. So, but what do you feel are the pros and cons of those models?
Well, let me link this one really quickly to the wagon wheel chart, because there's in addition to everything that you guys touched on with that, there's another kind of simple data visualization principle at play there, which is, if you have a wagon wheel chart, you have a circle, say you're using 5 metrics. So you're dividing that. The way it works visually, the way people do it, is they divide that circle into 5 equal segments because it looks pretty that way. And each segment gets a spoke, if you like, showing its value. And so you get these like weird representations of area within the circle, as if, for example, you're looking at one for a striker, as if like the goals metric is worth as much as the expected assists metric or the ground duels or something like that. So you get like kind of strange area representations that visually look like, wow, that's a lot of shaded territory in that chart, but not all the metrics are necessarily even the ones that you care about. Something, for these things, like you might not get a picture of what the player is actually meant to do in their position, let alone in their system and in their wider context. So that's to say, just to segue from that I, like JJ said, I definitely value data and I value data visualizations. I think they're useful tools and they provide insights, but there are and have to be caveats with that. And something like XG, which I think is a fairly long-standing metric that's widely used and has been shown to have pretty good predictive power in certain situations, it is valuable. But if you take even a really good metric like that and you use it for like per shot or per game or something like that, then you're just not getting as much explanatory power from that as you might if you're using it for a season or something like a longer term. But then some of these other, if you take something like expected assists, you're already explanatorily a degree removed from XG with that metric. Like you're banking on a sequence, an understanding of a sequence where the expected goal at the end of the sequence is impacting the XA metric, if that makes sense. So even there, I'm kind of more cautious about these, I guess, like more derivative metrics that require more explanatory leaps between one layer and the next. Because again, there's all the context that's not captured in the data, but then sometimes the data or the instrument itself is a little bit opaque or like not widely practiced or not widely understood or interpreted. So there aren't interpretive standards for them either. So I use these things, but I try not to rely on one thing and say like, this proves this. If somebody says, well, we hardly had any of the ball against Brentford, then I would say, well, I would feel pretty comfortable saying, well, look at the possession. But if somebody said like Frank's like ball progression is hopeless for the foreseeable future because of the XG against Arsenal, then I would say like you need to broaden the number of metrics and also forms of observation and evidence that you're bringing to bear on that question.
Yeah, because you're taking a 90-minute data point and using it as an answer to a 5-year rolling prediction of where someone's going to be. Those two things don't marry up. It's accurate to say we didn't create lots versus Arsenal in that game versus Arsenal. Yes, that is true. But it doesn't necessarily mean those things won't change. Go on, JJ.
Just going to add to that. So when we're talking specifically about XG and XT, expected threat, as Aaron has rightly said, they are either, you can call them derivative or you can call them stackable, whichever way you talk about these kind of things. So when you look at just XG, number one, we need to know the difference between subjective stats and objective stats. An objective stat is goals. Ball goes in the net and the goal is given, that is an objective stat, whereas XG is a subjective stat. Different companies do it in different ways. They decide what level and what points and what point of a point you get from where a shot is taken and what's happening in front of it and who the goalkeeper is. All of there's loads of things they use to decide it, but everyone uses a different one. And so it's a subjective statistic. So you've got XG, and then if you layer XG with XT, that gives a bit more context. So it's better. It's better when you use XG with expected threat. Those two things together give you a better, because they give you a bit deeper nuance. However, there are issues with XG on its own, and then there's issues with XT on its own. So for example, if you were talking about expected threat, it might be that threat doesn't take into account a backwards pass. So entering into an attacking area and then all of a sudden switching the ball out or moving it backwards to move it out, that might not be taken into context as increasing threat for the move. And if that is the case, even though that was the right thing to do, it was the way the coach set the team up, it's the way the team are desired to play to create chances, that's how they do it, that might not be taken into account by the data. So while the two things together are good because they provide more context and more nuance, they've both individually got areas that are problematic in terms of like how close they get to objective statistics, and therefore you have to take them with that pinch of salt.
Very good. We covered all the major points there, guys. Is there anything else you want to add on this? We good? There you go. I think it's important there's so many good points. I'm trying to summarize them. Cover me if I'm wrong here, guys. There's the point in time of these comparisons. That's the right way of saying it. Aaron, you were talking about this earlier. It's like you don't take a 90-minute snapshot and use that as a projection of information for, a long period of time. A lot of these numbers and stats that we're looking at in graphs that are all green could be largely irrelevant to what you need from that individual, and in the same light, so could the things that are in red or whatever. There's so much of this data you can layer on top of each other that you can pretty much pick what story you want to paint with it. A lot of it's led with unconscious and conscious biases. You could go on and on and on. So it's important. Data adds value. It's useful, but maybe at times we might go a bit far with it. Go on, Aaron.
Sorry, I just want to jump in with one thing that you just reminded me of that I think is kind of interesting and worth maybe mentioning, which is that I think the way in football, like the way it kind of works in politics too, although I'm not going to get into that. But it's like the way that we validate evidence and how we think we know something and can explain something is like we think about the credibility of the evidence. Like, do I trust the metric? We think about the credibility of the person providing the evidence, like, do I trust Opta? And these kinds of questions. But I think what we don't talk about as often as maybe we should is like how important it is, what you were just talking about, Jim, how important it is to like be able to evaluate the appropriateness of the kind of evidence that you're bringing to bear on the question. And I think a lot of people ask like a size 100 question and try to answer it with a size 2 data point. And that just won't do. Or they ask a question that just can't be really answered with data at all. And so when I do my work, I'm by no means a professional, just a hobbyist here. But when I do my work, I try really hard to use kind of a combination always of observation and data, eye test and different forms of analysis, because I just think like the questions that interest us as football fans are bigger than these little data questions often anyway.
JJ, you wanted to add a point there?
Sorry, one more and I promise we'll let you go. It's just it's a good
No,
discussion.
take your time. The more we've got to discuss, the better. I'm in no rush. We could talk about data all night long.
No one wants that. I think what I would say from a coaching perspective as well is you should always trust when you hear coaches and managers talking about, I need to see it back. And I don't mean the ones who are, did you see the handball? Did you see the penalty? Oh no, I wasn't watching at that moment in time. Let me watch it back. I'm not talking about that stuff. I'm talking about when a coach or a manager says, let me watch it back. That's a really important point, because as a coach, there's lots of things that we can do, and there's lots of ways that we can use data now. So what we can do is we can strap a little monitor to all of the players, and coaches can say to a player, you didn't put it in today. You weren't getting about the pitch. You weren't running. And at the end of the day, there is going to be some objective data on that. There is going to be the kilometers moved. There's going to be the cadence, the pace they were moving at. That data will be there. And that's super useful for coaches. There really isn't anywhere for these elite players to hide anymore, because we can use that kind of stuff to analyze their performance. It goes straight into the laptop, straight into the computer, and that data is available at the final whistle. Don't even need to wait for tomorrow to bring you in and talk to you about it. So coaches can use that kind of stuff, but look at it as a positive point when a coach is talking about something that happened in a game and says, I need to watch that back. Because one of the things that coaches are going to do is they're going to be looking at a lot more than just that zoomed in moment of, did this player, make a mistake, for example. It's normally the kind of context that we're talking about. Actually, what they're going to do is they're going to look at that plus the unit around them, plus the zone around that, plus everything that's in front of it, everything to the side of it. And then they're going to look at the phase of play. Then they're going to look at what the opposition were doing at that time. Then they're going to have a think about what was the game state at that minute. And all of those things together are going to lead you as a coach. You're going to be able to take that step back, and you're going to be able to go in and you're going to be able to use the data point, whatever it was, plus that ability to focus on all of those other bits to really come to a good conclusion. And those are the layers. The best coaches can do that without a laptop. They can do it without needing to see the stats. The really, really top guys and the people that have been in the game for a really long time, they're the ones that pretty much see everything anyway. and then they just get little bits and pieces backed up. But when you do hear a manager saying, I'm just going to go back and have a look at that, it's because they're going to add a ton of context to the data.
And you see that relating to Spurs game with Thomas Frank's style of management. You know, we just compared it before with his predecessor. Postecoglou seemed to be much more of a his leadership style was, I'm the person at the front of that touchline, and I'm the one, you know, making the observations and making the decisions based on my perceptions. Frank, you said, is groupthink. Is that the type of leadership more where it's, hey, that happened. What does everyone think? You know, what's the data say? What happens there? Big pros and cons to each in both extremes. And I guess different levels of groupthink managers and different levels of individual leadership styles as well. So it's not meant to be one's better than the other, just to caveat that. And JJ, and Aaron, there's another bit of data that we talk about, like player fitness. So much data these players have on them during games. I know my camera keeps going there. But like, we don't see that. And I think often we make judgment on substitutions, players' minutes, all those kind of things. And when it's about a player's personal health and, you know, around their own fitness, we just don't have that data to really pass fair judgment, but we pass strong opinions on those topics anyway. But anyway, I think my camera's trying to tell me something every time I keep switching off. So thanks very much, gents. And come on, you Spurs.
Up the Spurs.